Okay, so welcome everybody again. I saw that the posters were very animated, so we'll have another session of posters this afternoon, and we can actually resume the discussions on the posters and so on. We would like to actually go back and resume the main program with the presentations. Just a couple of remarks. One is, please, again, if you are not going to talk, try to make sure that your microphone is in mute so that we don't have any background noise or anything like that. And also, if you have any question during the question session, please press the button to raise your hand, because we are now quite a few people in the Zoom, which is actually great. But at the same time, we are not able to see you when you actually try to talk. So to avoid having a lot of confusion in the Q&A, please press the button to raise your hand, and then we'll actually see it and we'll order the questions. Okay, so this brings us to the next invited speaker. So it's our pleasure to have Felix Schürmann with us to talk about simulation of brain tissue in using high-performance computing. So Felix is an adjunct professor at EPFL, and he's the co-director of the Blue Brain project, and he's also affiliated to the Brain Mind Institute at EPFL. So he is an expert on how to actually use HPC to simulate neural networks and try to model how the tissue actually behaves, the brain tissue behaves. So his work has been actually modeling the brain tissue behavior and operation. And he's going to actually talk to us about all this. So see what are the typical challenges that he has found and the new opportunities that he has found as well for brain tissue simulations. And we'll hope to see how this actually aligns to with HPC. And I believe Felix can actually show us all this in a very interesting talk. So Felix, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's exceptional circumstances. My slides still say Geneva, or sort of should have said Lausanne, but anywhere on Earth, I guess it's now the right thing to say. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here in this context, in the sense that really the intersection of machine learning and HPC, I think, is very relevant for everybody of us doing computational science. And I'll try to sort of highlight a little bit how that intersects with our work, and where we might be able to do more, and sort of in exchange of the different experts and communities, I think we can improve further. So in a way, I want to start with something which is important in this discussion, especially when you talk about simulating the brain. And I want to start with an analogy. And that analogy is, you don't need to be a bird to fly. What I mean by that is that we actually manage to, if it is about the function of flight, we manage to recreate that function by other types of machines and other types of physics even, especially when you do flight in this way where sort of aerodynamics play less of a role and it's just about thrust. What this is all meant to say is that I may not need to study the bird in all its nitty-gritty details if I want to learn more about the function of flight, or if I even just want to recreate the function of flight. And that's in a way relevant for when we're talking about the brain, because there is a confusion amongst ourselves, amongst our colleagues, and maybe even those of us listening to this, is if it's about understanding the brain, do we talk about recreating the function, or do we talk about understanding the brain? And so if it is about trying to understand how the brain does create its different abilities, from acrobatics to intellectual to sort of explorative and inquisitive, but more importantly, if it is about trying to understand what happens in the brain if things go wrong, right? Whether it is in young age, adolescent age, or sort of in higher ages, then you really have to study the brain. You have to study the biophysics and the biochemistry of the brain. And you're not getting away with something which has a similarly good function. Again, why this is relevant, if we think about machine learning and especially neural networks in that context, which in a way took some long time ago, some inspiration from the brain, and sort of we now find them to, for example, recreate some function that we typically also assign to the brain, like for example, object detection, then it is, if it's about object detection, then it's a completely legitimate question how much of the details of the brain really do matter, right? And you can argue, well, these very abstract units, sigmoidal inactivation and backpropagation, sort of are doing a pretty damn good job in recreating that function. But of course, they will not tell us much about sort of what might go wrong in a certain genetic disease or in an epilepsy or something. I mean, they're meant to do different things. But really, when it is about the brain, this is important. Now, or distinction is important. The Blue Brain project, which I joined 15 years, I'm a co-director of, is set out to do computational science for the brain. And so we are trying to understand and model the biophysics and biochemistry of the brain. So we are really much in the details and not so much in the function of abstraction. Of course, there are similarities and sort of intersections at different places. So we can use machine learning to do what we do better, and I'll talk about some of that today. But I will not talk about now how we can use neuroscience to improve machine learning. That would be another talk, and there's a lot of people who think about which additional ideas can I use from brain science to sort of do maybe the next generation of machine learning. But that's not our core focus, and that's not going to be the focus of this talk. Now, if you accept that setting that I laid out, it's worth to sort of confront yourself with the formidable challenge you took on. And the brain is probably the one of, if not the most complex system that we know, that has to do with the fact that with sheer numbers, the human brain has 100 billion neurons, 1,000 times or 10,000 times more synapses than neurons. It has other types of cells, glial cells, that are as numerous as neurons. And every cell is a universe in the sense that sort of there might be billions of proteins in a cell, synapses, connections. There's all the genetic diversity. Molecules react to drugs, and sort of how essentially a drug that hits a receptor down here unfolds and sort of makes you sort of be more, have less headaches or have sort of better concentrations, however, is really not understood. We understand a lot at every single one of these levels, don't get me wrong, right? We've been studying the brain with modern neuroscience for the last 120 years or so, but it is really still very difficult to sort of follow this chain of scales from sort of something that happens at the molecular level until you go to the doctor and sort of say, I felt dizzy the other day. And it is this challenge, this multiple scales, heterogeneity that sort of we're faced with when trying to make progress on the brain, and progress on understanding the healthy brain, progress on understanding the diseased brain, and of course, ultimately trying to develop cures, which sort of kind of mean that you have to master this landscape. And to give you an example, that's sort of something like, I mean, you can pick any phenomenon in the brain, whether it's an EEG signal, or whether it is your memory, or whether it is your ability to feel emotions, whatever. You can pick a property of the brain and ask the question, how does that actually unfold in this complex system? And sort of you see here on the left-hand side, spatial scales, which range from nanometers, where your proteins fold to the entire brain, which is maybe 10 centimeters, and time scales from sort of, nanoseconds, where some of the diffusion and reactions happen, to years of lifespan. For a human being, 100 years. So we have spatial scales of multiple orders of magnitude. We have time scales of multiple orders of magnitude. And you can now pick any of those set phenomena. And for example, in this case, long-term plasticity. So it's what we believe the ability of the brain to ultimately store memories. So plasticity in our word and language is sort of underlying the formations of memories. And it refers to the storage or the modification of the structure and other parts of the brain to encode things it has seen, heard, or otherwise remembers. And you can now sort of say, well, we believe that on the one hand, I mean, this really is carried by the neurons. So you have to sort of go at the level of micrometers, and sort of you have to address the diversity of these neurons and how they're connected, because obviously a lot of these changes of plasticity happen between neurons. So one neuron sending signals to another neuron. When you sort of look into that, there's a lot of parameters that affect this. I mean, how do these connections form? Where do they form? What are the dynamics of this connection? And sort of there are different timescales involved until sort of something from short-term behavior becomes something long-term. And if you look at that, yeah, you might be able to sort of say, sure, I mean, I can abstract that and sort of say, look, it's just a change of a weight. I mean, that's what long-term plasticity is. But in that biophysical and biochemical system of the brain, this is mediated by essentially that level of detail. And now that's, again, if you think about taking inspiration for flying, take whatever sort of solves your problem. But if it's about saying what happens if essentially something goes wrong, because essentially if you take a drug that affects one of these neurons, you might be affecting the long-term plasticity of a certain pathway. Then sort of these details matter, which is why, of course, developing drugs is so complicated, because essentially the side effects of something that is working for one configuration might sort of not be clear in another configuration. And that's really the challenge we're up to, and why I think understanding the brain is such a formidable challenge. Yeah, so again, 120 years of modern neuroscience, and I think a lot of our science is experimental in nature. There's still a lot to be measured for a long time, so there's no doubt that experimentation, I think, is a core pillar of it. Theory, on the other hand, sort of, I think, has had not yet the same impact as in physics, because essentially of this complex system nature of the brain where details matter. And what the Blue Brain started out 15 years ago to kind of bring as an additional method to the table is what I think many other disciplines in engineering and science have long adopted as a complementary tool, and that's simulation science. And that's the short history of that since from the Second World War, when the first general purpose electronic computers came about. And every decade essentially saw more disciplines jump on that incredible ride of increasing and now exponentially increasing, at least for the moment, computing capabilities. And in a way, in the beginning, we were able to do mechanical models. At some point, we could do fluid mechanics that led to weather predictions, and so on. And in a way, what is particular here about this is that brain science is absent, and sort of we hope that sort of the Blue Brain project will be remembered as a project that really has been trying to push the approaches of simulation science to neuroscience. Again, not to replace what we do in experimentation, but to sort of bring this to the table as a complementary approach. And so the Blue Brain project is a simulation neuroscience project, and I really think of this as a method much more. So it's not the goal to build a brain model, but it's a methodology to absorb data, to build models from that data, to sort of use these models to run simulated experiments, to validate those experiments against the simulated experiments against real experiments, and then sort of continue with this cycle. And why this is so important is, I mean, this is like if you built a virtual car to run a virtual crash test. You do an attempt, you sort of see, wait a second, this way this type of crash will sort of be more complicated. So let's change our car, and sort of you optimize until you build a real car to do that. And in many ways, in neuroscience, the equivalent of that is, of course, that, I mean, every day brings new data. We learn about, we have new methods that sort of can measure the brain differently. And all of that allows us to sort of integrate that data and build these progressively improving models that we think are sort of ultimately approaching fairly accurate representations of this brain tissue, and ultimately entire brain. But of course, that's sort of where high performance computing comes into the game, and I'll speak about that. So the Blue Brain project is a Swiss national infrastructure project that's funded by the ETH board, so by the Swiss public. It's implemented as a center at EPFL, and we sort of bring together a team of about 130 scientists and engineers to bring this computational science and engineering discipline to neuroscience. And that's not so obvious. It took us actually 10 years from the start of the project to when we were really ready to publish the first reconstruction of a brain tissue, which actually is a tissue, part of the neocortical brain tissue, which is where we think most of our cognitive abilities actually are homed. But we only reconstructed a cubic millimeter of that tissue, and that of a 14-day-old rat. So this is not an entire brain, it's not a human brain, but essentially is an attempt to integrate everything that was known about that brain tissue in one model. And so this paper is a highly collaborative paper, 82 authors, and while sort of maybe our colleagues sort of that work in high energy physics and others, I mean, that's nothing, right? You have collaborations of 1,000 people. In neuroscience, that was this amount of collaborativeness in a single publication, I think was a novum. And this paper essentially is not about a model, but it's about the process we've been applying to go from the data, sort of how we account for the different cell types, the diversity, the connections, how do we place them, how do we connect, how do we install their electrical behavior in them with mathematical models and so on. So about where this is all leading to, that a single neuron in this brain model is modeled by about 20,000 differential equation to describe the physics that's ongoing, and I'll talk about that in more detail. So the core of this is a set of workflows, a set of software, if you wish, that is essentially here depicted in the schema, where sort of you have the experimental data of different modalities in the beginning, in the upper row here, and then sort of we have computational workflows that extract parameters from this data and build mathematical models of the physics we want to describe, of the cells, of the tissue. And then we can run essentially those models in a simulator that then allows us to run these in silico experiments and analyze them and bring the scientist into the loop. But all of those parts actually are part of our science. So I mean, as much do we learn about the data while building the models as we do by sort of running then the final models for predictions and others. So essentially all of this that's sort of why I'm calling it the methodology of what we're doing. And to give you some example, what sort of highlights that we've been doing here, and we've been innovating a lot in organizing data about different types of channels and cells. We've developed data management platforms like Nexus, which are provenance-based knowledge graphs that sort of really are applicable to the heterogeneity of the data and applicable to other domains. We've built resources, atlas resources out of that, so that essentially we can consume that data. We've built automated parameterization, parameter optimization workflows that take data, extract parameters, and search for other data. Of course, we'll talk about that we essentially have to solve the parallel simulation problem, which is, of course, the most costly part in this computational science workflow. We have to sort of data models that only live in the computer aren't particularly useful, so we have to do something about that to visualize them. So essentially, there's computational science everywhere. The icons here show you where is the computing. And sort of this is how our latest computer actually looks like before its upgrade. So this is, and after its upgrade, it's a 2 petaflop class machine provided, sort of built by HPE, and it's installed in the Swiss National Supercomputing Center, CSCS in Lugano, and operated and used by our scientists in Geneva. So it's a 2 petaflop class machine to run the type of models of the size of a mouse brain today. Now, what we've been doing since this publication in 2015, we essentially used this workflow to really scale it up. So we are now, while sort of we were simulating a microcircuit with maybe 30,000 neurons in 2015, we now have models of the size of 10 million neurons here on the right-hand side of an entire neocortex of a mouse. And we essentially applied it to different parts of different brain regions. So essentially, that's why I'm alluding so much about the workflow that is essentially allowing us to rerun that on other data and for other things. And that is, of course, really carried by the increase of computational power on the one hand, and of course, algorithmic improvements that allow us to run this cycle faster. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So essentially, if I just go back here, I'll highlight in today's talk, so with the given that we talk about machine learning and the interaction of HPC. So one of the machine learning attempts I will talk about is actually here in the data ingestion, which sort of where machine learning is helping us at different fronts to sort of do something which previously we had to do by hand. And I'll talk about how machine learning might help in the simulation part. Now, sort of this is now where I'm jumping into a part of this workflow. This is about data, brain data measured in slices of the brain. So this is a section through a brain. And sort of this is the type of, after staining, after applying a chemical process to this brain tissue, it highlights certain cells, and sort of it reveals structures of brain and counts of cells and so on. And we are ingesting this data in order to sort of decide for our model positions, proportions, types, placements, and in the end sort of use this to build a full model with geometric detail and the structures. I'll not go into all the detail, but sort of one of the problems we have is we are ingesting these staining data, and the issue is, of course, it's like in other medical imaging where you have I don't know, MRI data where sort of every brain is different, every slice is different. They come out deformed, and sort of simply because the brains aren't all identical. They're different, and sort of you have to now ask the question, how can I integrate data from different experiments into one model, right? So you have to align the stains to an atlas, and that's what we are sort of what we looked for in machine learning to improve. So here you have a typical problem of image registration, where sort of you have one instance of your data, which you can call moving. And with a transformation, you want to sort of bring this to your registered data set, which is kind of, I mean, you're translating the real thing after sort of some deformation into what it should be looking if you were looking at an ideal brain. And that's I mean, if you don't do that, if you only leave it there, you cannot integrate these different data points. So it's, I think, a common problem in many disciplines, especially in the imaging discipline. So this is just the description of sort of that you want to have some transformation that sort of in a way per pixel allows you to sort of correct that pixel. And so here machine learning can clearly help. So how can machine learning for atlas alignment help? So previously gold standard approaches is literally manual landmark based non-rigid transformations. And we've been doing that, other people have been doing that. That's simply the best we have and had. And then, of course, there are other approaches like symmetric normalization, which really is about a similarity metric between the ground truth and your data. So I mean, there are ways to sort of automate that somehow. And Jan Kreppel and Francesco Casaleño from our team have been saying, well, that's nice, but we can do better. And sort of they introduced a machine learning based approach to do, which is non-parametric, so predict pixel-wise displacement for elastic transformation, so to have a full diversity of transformation, using supervised learning of displacement directly compared to the ground truth. And by training with a perceptual similarity loss, these models actually allowed to produce smooth deformations. And they showed that this generalizes actually nicely not only to the same type of data, but even if you're staining for different properties in this brain. So essentially that there's something to be, I mean, that the method picks up landmarks that sort of are useful beyond the data set you're trained on. And the type of structure, the architecture they used here is essentially combining global and local transformations. So this is the global part is like a spatial transformer network, which literally avoids you having to scale and size the problem, but that's done automatically. So that is essentially brought into the right center and the right global framing, if you wish. And then there's a unit that actually computes the local transformations that need to be applied to kind of minimize the error function, which in this case includes this perceptual loss to have the smooth transformations. And so when you do that, and you train that, you see here that the three different rows are different types of staining. So the first one is the actual reference staining, and sort of in a sense that's a Nissl stain, and where the sort of the left column is the reference, and the second column is sort of how these things come out of the experiment. And then sort of you see how the different steps apply first a global transformation, and then the local one. And on the very right hand side, you see the transformation fields that come out of that. And then the different rows are essentially different variants of this data set. And when we so said it can generalize, sometimes we can train on the first and the second row, and we can even make predictions of the third row. And if you compare that with different comparison metrics, sort of the machine learning is systematically as good or even better than the previous symmetric normalization approach, and it's as good as the ground truth. And it now allows us to sort of do this faster. And that really is, I think, one of those examples where machine learning simply has shown useful. And essentially, this is one example of. So there are other parts in the pipeline and in the workflow where sort of we use similar approaches to replace previously manual or sort of other methods and accelerate them. Now, that's sort of kind of machine learning for HPC, but not quite yet HPC. It's machine learning for computational science. Now, if we talk about the part which is the simulation, so now that we have built these models, we have all the equations, now it's about simulating it. So what I mean by simulation is solving the time dimension of these models, right? The brain is a dynamical system, and sort of neurons fire electrical signals, and sort of our differential equations, these 20,000 differential equations per neuron, describe exactly that behavior. And luckily, before we started, so in actually 1984, Michael Hines from Yale University created a simulation environment tailored to the type of mathematics that have to be solved in computational neuroscience. And we've been teaming up with him. And for the last 10 years, we've been essentially driving the simulator to become a type of tool that's capable of simulating the size of models we're simulating. And to give you just an idea, I mean, 15 years ago, the software was not parallelized, right? So one of the first things we had to do was actually parallelize that software so that we can use the parallel computers that sort of all of supercomputing is, high performance computing is based on. And if you do that, you have just, you start getting into trouble. You have to do reproducible random numbers. You have to sort of think about maybe parallel linear algebra. You have to sort of do a lot of I/O and checkpoint restart and all of that. And more importantly, you have to watch out that sort of you're flexible enough for the different architectures and that are evolving in the HPC frame. So this is really what fair part of my own interest is actually tailored on, that sort of improving and ensuring that type of the simulation pipeline. And here I'll talk you a little bit through what these things are. I mean, how the mathematics look. So on the left-hand side is a neuron, looks a little bit like a tree. These things get spatially discretized in order to sort of, so we treat them as electrical cables. So in a way, underlying is a cable equation, which you segment into the individual pieces so that you can, instead of solving a PDE, you can solve a set of coupled ODEs. And in each of these compartments, as we call them, you have now the physics of what makes this neuron a neuron. And here we model the capacitance, we model these membrane proteins, which are ion channels, which are actually responsible for the electrical behavior of neuron. These are not rocket science equations. They're actually relatively straightforward ODEs. But the problem is there are many of those, because essentially there's sort of these ion channels sit all across these branches and in different quantities, and synapses are being formed all over. So that essentially we not only have to solve these equations for every single compartment, we also have to sort of solve how these compartments are connected, which is this set of coupled ODEs, thanks to the discretization, which sort of you see here, that sort of for each of those things, you not only get the current contributions from the transmembrane current, but you also get simply the currents from the neighboring compartments. So that's the, and essentially we have to solve all of that every time step in order to calculate the progression of the electrical activity. Then these cells, and so I said this is about 20,000 differential equations if you count it together. Now these neurons aren't alone; they connect to each other. They form synapses, and many of those. And this is the pictogram just saying, well, then this neuron sends an axon to this other neuron, forms a synapse, which so this electrical signal is propagating down and releases neurotransmitters. So it's an electrochemical transduction, creating then an electrical deflection in the connected neuron. And again, we're describing this biophysics with equations that essentially describe phenomenological how these synapses behave. Now, in your artificial neural network, where you have neurons or, well, your sigmoidal nodes, this would be just a weight, right? So this entire thing here, which is a synapse with a differential equations that sort of has short-term plasticity and all that, that would just be a weight. And sort of in the real brain, these things are more complex devices. And then, of course, since it's a network, we have to exchange all of those events in the network. And in a parallel setting, if you have sort of multiple neurons, we can sort of advance each neuron. So the base equation of each neuron goes for some time until a neuron might spike. And then we need to exchange all these events to all the others so that then the receiving neurons can sort of activate this mathematics. So again, it is really not a very complex set of mathematics, but it's very heterogeneous in terms of what needs to be computed, and many thereof. And that's sort of what computational we have to solve. And sort of the computational loop, in a way you can look at, is essentially that you deliver sort of these spike events, so that your presynaptic neuron has spike. Then you calculate for that time step the different currents, you update your voltage, you sort of update your equations, and you see whether there's a spike, and then you deliver that for each neuron, for each time step, until your simulation is done. And what might be computationally important is, so now how costly are these different steps? Right now we're talking HPC. Now you want to sort of crank out as much as possible of those computations given the machine you have. And so this tells you that sort of this communication is actually 7% of the overall computation, which means that our problems scale very nicely to very large levels of parallelism. So we've run simulations on up to 3 million threads concurrently, simply because underlyingly these are fairly loosely coupled. The linear algebra part is minute, and everything else actually is the solving of these simple ordinary differential equations, either the one of the compartments or the ones of the individual mechanisms. And that's sort of what we're faced with. And accordingly, sort of a lot of our HPC engineering is about making this part as efficient as possible. So this neural environment as sort of is an entire framework. It's like a MATLAB for neuroscientists. And it has a lot of layers, introspection layers and so on. And one of the work we did recently in the last couple of years is we only extracted and focused on the computational core of that environment. So the nice thing is we have a domain-specific language, which allows us to sort of, I'll come back to that in a minute. But sort of instead of 350,000 lines of code of Neuron, we only now have to work only with 60,000 lines of code, which is much better. So this is relatively recent. We published that, it's open source. And so now that allows us to actually have a factor 7 in memory reduction and a speed up between 2 and 7, depending on the model, depending on the architecture. But sort of this is the type of really, I mean, big win by simply reducing the amount of overhead and allowing to lay out your data structures in a way that they're cache efficient and all of that. So that's in a way the traditional bread and butter HPC, but it gives a good idea of sort of what you have to do to, I mean, this factor 7 memory reduction essentially is a factor 7 in price reduction of the system you would have to buy, right, given the same model. And another thing we've been doing is sort of, since we have a domain-specific language that encodes sort of the biophysical mechanisms that the neuroscientists want to do, we decided to intercept that and really apply a modern source-to-source compilation framework to that. So we do the essentially the interpretation of this language, which is called NModel, and we create an abstract syntax tree, which now we can use to do different optimization passes. And I mean, they can be by sort of, again, we are applying actually analytical solving of some ordinary differential equations. We can identify variables from simple parameters, so things that change and that's which are read-only or write-only. We can possibly reduce the precision of some of these parameters. So all of that we can now sort of put into this these different optimization passes. And nicely, we can also create software for different backends. We can create, say, something for C++ MPI. We can create against the backend, which is OpenMP, ACC, or CUDA directly, or others. So now this, I think, is something which a lot of HPC codes now are going to, that sort of with this using DSLs and the code generation, you no longer are bound to one implementation, but you can relatively easily change platforms, which I think is in this age and time very important, because essentially it's not clear which platforms will be the ones that will make the race and that will keep us having some more increase in performance over while Moore's law was flattening. So I think this architectural diversity and readiness is a key take-home message that we had to do. And sort of you see here that sort of, I mean, we can indeed generate, again, through those optimizations, do a number of nice optimizations on different platforms. Here I only show Skylake and KNL, but we've also in the meantime have addressed GPUs and others. Now, if you take this even one step further, you really want to probably understand where this is all going. So together with a PhD student of mine, we embarked on doing analytical performance modeling of the type of models we're simulating, and sort of really trying to get to understand what are the asymptotic behaviors in terms of complexity and memory, and then sort of how the different parts of models actually differ, sort of that, I mean, how the stiffness makes you have to sort of apply a certain time step per time, how the coupling ratio matters and sort of affects you when you sort of, your neurons have to communicate more often or not. And in a way, the same framework actually also even applies to the more abstract neural networks, because really in the end, so this is what it boils down to, sort of, if you have a certain stiffness, you have to run a certain number of sequential time steps, and there's nothing else you can do. And so we've been applying that, and this has recently been published in 2 papers where we essentially used a methodology which is an extension to the roofline models. It's called execution cache models, which make a model the full memory hierarchy of a specific piece of hardware, in this case a Skylake architecture, but you can essentially build models for others. And through that, you can now really understand which of your computational kernels sort of saturate which part of the pipeline. On the right-hand side, you see here on the columns are different complexity of models. So the left-hand side are detailed models and then more simplified models. And the pictogram on the rows show you that what happened if your data fit into the level 1 cache, level 2 cache, level 3 cache, or you have to fetch it from main memory. And you sort of see on these graphs here sort of what are the computational parts of the problem we have, and sort of which hardware is limiting us. And sort of if you have the memory bandwidth, then sort of really your sort of the exponential is one of the functions that really we have to watch out for. However, sort of if your model, if you don't have the memory bandwidth and you have to fetch the data from DRAM, then the DRAM bandwidth really becomes the bottleneck. And that's very important, because essentially, in the end, what that tells us is we're not a problem like LinPack or something where sort of we have, or encryption, where we have a computational dense problem, but we are essentially mostly, in realistic cases, memory bandwidth bound. And that is true for, if you look here at the left, I mean, that is true for many configurations. And only in certain configurations at some point, you would actually get issues with the network latency. And so thanks to this work now, for the first time, we have a very quantitative understanding of what part of the hardware actually we need to watch out for to keep our capabilities of brain simulation growing. And we still have to grow a lot. I mean, we've been now simulating models with 10 million neurons. The mouse brain has roughly 100 million, and the human would have 100 billion. So we have a factor 1,000 to go, and that's sort of in where Moore's law is going. That's not really obvious. I want to close in the last couple of minutes. So all of this is pushing our research to sort of think differently, and sort of how can we rethink this computational problem. And one of them is asynchronous execution. So many of the things today, we're running bulk synchronous protocols in our simulation engines. And we have indication to believe that that's actually, we can do better than that. So this is another PhD student of mine, which together with Thomas Sterling, Indiana University, who is one of the gurus of HPC, we've been using an asynchronous execution framework to sort of see whether we can, if the programming model allows us to more easily express asynchronicity, can we do that? And so this is one way of gaining factors of 2, 3 in speed. Another thing, of course, is you could say, do you really have to solve all of those differential equations? And that brings you into a more theoretical reduction of your model. So instead of modeling hundreds of compartments, maybe you can get away with modeling just tens of compartments. So here we have a recently published paper together with colleagues in Israel, where sort of we kind of use a smart way to have a reduced model that allows us to map all of the connections of the neuron to an appropriate simplified cable. And so this combination, so 1, we are reducing the number of compartments, and 2, we are collapsing synapses, which of course not always is possible. So we are losing something through that. But if you do that, you actually might see runtime acceleration factors of a lot, talking essentially something like 100, 200 fold. Now, that is, it comes at a cost, right? So I think this is very nice. I mean, because it tells us that if Moore's law really gets us into trouble, then that's probably a path we have to do, but we are losing detail, right? Because if you are for a model where the spatial placements matter because you want to calculate EEG, then the simplified model will not do that. But it's just showing you that sort of we're trying to innovate to sort of make this computationally tractable. And that brings me to my last slide, which is that can machine learning help here, right? A number of communities are now talking about recasting their computational problem as machine learning problems. And I think it has shown, and we'll hear more about that today, in weather forecast and other fluid mechanics and other cases. This, I think, is really showing amazing results nowadays. For our simulations, we are not quite clear yet how exactly that will play out. Here's a paper by this group of Idan Segev, which sort of says, look, instead of all the modeling, all the equations, all these 20,000 differential equations I just showed you, can I maybe get away by just sort of learning the input-output relationship of that with a neural network, right? So I'm using a neural network of the convolutional type to model a single neuron of a biophysical type. And so they created tons of input data, so they then bombard this neuron with input data. Then they have these output data, and then they simply learn this type of convolutional neural network to predict these outputs from these inputs, and that works. So they can do that. What is not clear quite yet is whether that's computationally really cheaper. Well, probably the inference of this model is cheaper than my 20,000 differential equations. But the big challenge we have is we don't understand yet, there's no guarantee on the accuracy of those input-output relations. And importantly, this learned just this particular neuron with this input configuration. And that means the next neuron or that same neuron in a different configuration would not be essentially represented correctly by this network. So I think we have not yet decomposed which parts of our simulations or our models should we really be replacing with machine learning models. But it's first attempts, and I think we'll continue our work to sort of see whether it's from a performance modeling point of view actually beneficial. And then I think we have to work more closely with others, sort of which exactly should we do. And that's sort of why I really enjoyed having been here today, to sort of listen to others and see how they do it. In any case, all of this is to make sure, I mean, we are on a really computational grand challenge problem. If you plot the fastest computers to date, while there might still be a little bit of room in Moore's law, but not so much. So we have a flop challenge, but most importantly, we have a memory capacity challenge and memory bandwidth challenge. And this is only going to get worse if we include more subcellular detail in other parts. So we're in for a long ride of need in compute power, and anything that can help us to sort of leverage more out of what's there already is, I think, in our playbooks. And with that, I just would like to really thank my colleagues, my PhD students, and sort of the pros from the Blue Brain high performance computing section, machine learning section, that really are sort of bringing this to full production strength so that we can actually do the science with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felix. So we move then now to the part of questions. Those that would like to talk or ask a question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, in the meantime, I would like to ask Felix one question on my own, if he doesn't mind, about the models that you have. So one of the latest, let's say, I would say progress that actually is happening in machine learning and all these areas for optimizing these networks and so on, is all the work that is done in PyTorch and TensorFlow and so other things to actually do the automatic transformations and so on. So you have your own programming language to try to simplify the writing of the modeling of the brain and so on. How can have you looked at how you can apply the same type of techniques that actually these languages are implementing? Because from that point of view, you are simplifying the effort of writing your problem, but on the other hand, you may not capitalize from the new techniques that have been developed there.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think sort of we're, as I described, I mean, ecosystems of software are important, and sort of, I mean, our overall model building and simulation workflow is, I think, carried by probably 30 software applications that sort of have common addressing schemes in terms of sort of interpreting the models and the variables and sort of, so they're sort of, I mean, those are difficult to switch overnight. That said, I think absolutely and it's amazing how much work I think the machine learning community has been able to put into tools that previously were not progressing very quickly, and now suddenly they're just amazing how they progressed. So I think we are clearly watching out to embrace that as much as possible, and sort of, I mean, a lot of our machine learning efforts to sort of address our own data things sort of there, the integration with the right frameworks for training and then also deployment of these machine learning methods. That's something we're acutely aware of and we're doing. Now, when it comes to these model reductions, those parts, I think they're still, I mean, until we know whether, I mean, so these are really heavy machine, high HPC workflows running on tightly coupled systems. I mean, they really are integrated with that world, and I think there's still a discrepancy. So while we see a lot of containers and a lot of these frameworks come to bring machine learning to HPC, I think the HPC models that really are down to the metal, they are sort of still living in their own world. I hope there will be more convergence, but so I think there's more work to be done.
Thank you, Felix. Any other questions?
Yeah, I raised my hand. So for those of you who want to ask questions, click on the participants button, and there is a raise hand button there. And then when you're done with your question, you can lower your hand. Thank you very much, Felix, for this talk. We have been following ML a lot, and many of us have also been following HPC a lot, but it's really good to think about some of the applications, and it's historically simulation that then move on a bit to deep learning. And you've done a lot of work on characterizing the machine requirements for simulation for the brain project. And now with some of these models perhaps benefiting from ML, can you comment on if a vendor would want to build a machine for you for the next phase of the project, what would those requirements be? Are the requirements similar so that they will continue just building more memory and higher bandwidth memory? Or would this shift to ML would then require that you would host both simulation and ML, and they would have to accommodate that?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what we're trying to bring or to wrap our head around. And I think first of all, unfortunately, nobody will build a system for me. In the sense, I think we're too small a community for that. So I think in many ways we're opportunistically trying to sort of live with what the world is building anyways, or what you can build given the physics that's left in those systems. Now, that said, I mean, ideally we would like to understand as much about our problem so that we can nudge it just this extra little millimeter into sort of something, hey, if you could include that thing, then it would really work. Now, so that I think that's the base strategy. Now, then in more detail, yeah, I think we are in the types of models we want to do. I mean, memory capacity and memory bandwidth are sort of the important factors. And then I think there's still things which we have to yet understand, and that sort of was my last part of the talk. Can we essentially leverage this atomization that we've seen in hardware on the machine learning side? So all the tensor processing units and all that effort to sort of go from 64-bit precision to 32-bit, 16-bit, and so on. And I think there we're still in the beginning. So I think we've seen a lot of work from people from linear algebra that sort of you can rethink algorithms to sort of really kind of atomize your algorithms in that to really make benefit of what these architectures do. We're not done there yet. And but I think there's room for us to sort of rewrite some of the algorithms to leverage some of those hardware innovations. In the end, of course, I would say I'm still a little bit worried about the total memory capacity and memory bandwidth that seem to be sort of, unfortunately, two variables that don't go well together. So essentially, you might have to decide at some point, which I think will be dramatic limitation in a way. So that part I'm worried about. Again, I think sort of the bandwidth we get in some of those machine learning optimized systems, I think we ought to be able to really leverage if we get that right. And then I think underlying, and that's sort of the maybe the most interesting part. So we're coming from computational science and assuming really a precision and reproducibility we're used to with 64-bit precision, deterministic behavior of all the parts of the components. And funnily enough, we have a community in our realm, which is the neuromorphic folks that sort of have been long ago saying, hey, what happens actually if you're giving up some of those things? And so saying, you don't need all that precision, you don't need all that determinism. And I think this is not mainstream computational science because you inherit a whole bag of other problems. But I think that is going to be interesting, that sort of some of the transformation of our codes actually, if they're willing to loosen up some of those requirements in terms of precision and determinism, in a way what the neuromorphic folks have done already, I think then we might be able to use these architectures even in a yet different way. But I mean, that comes with another bag of problems in many ways, because sort of now you have to convince your scientists that sort of this is all still producing the right science. But I think there's, I mean, I see that sort of the use of machine learning for our problems might require that we are actually giving up some of the nice features we had in terms of accuracy and reproducibility. But then again, if that makes it possible for you to simulate a problem and it makes it much faster, then sort of maybe that's worth all the effort.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think that HPC, it's difficult to design platforms for HPC because you have to have a commercial incentive. But there are now commercial platforms for machine learning. And unfortunately, neuromorphic is not one of them yet. So I'm guessing that in the future, the vendors you'll be working with, you might actually find machine learning building blocks that come from the commercial sector, and those are already being marketed. So.
No, very, very much. And last reaction to that, I think, I mean, simply when you look at given that I think even the traditional machine learning will become part of all of our workflows in some or another form. I mean, these systems at scale, if you look into the US DOE, I mean, they are essentially hybrids of that. And I think anybody who cannot use the machine learning part of that hardware, you will lose out on a lot of bang if you don't do that. So I think it's just, I mean, again, in a purely sort of opportunistic mode, I mean, we have to sort of make sure that we can learn to exploit that hardware for us. And again, we have some initial ideas and some other fundamental properties that tell us, look, I mean, we have to watch out for that are different from machine learning, that sort of we have to deal with differently.
Thank you very much, Felix. Any other questions from any other participants? You can raise your hand as Babak explained you, so you can go on the right side and you have there on the chat, on top of the chat, actually the list of participants, and you can actually activate. Okay. I don't see any more hands, virtual hands up. Okay, so then we are perfectly on time, so it's actually interesting that we managed to get there perfectly on time virtually, more than in person. But thank you very much, Felix, once again. I think it was a very interesting talk. And then, as we mentioned to all of you, we would like to try to get the presentations online as well, so you can also look at the slides again, and then I'm sure that Felix will be happy to answer your questions if you send him an email after the presentation.